There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They don't announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They slip in through a cracked open door on a Tuesday night, smelling of rain and exhaustion, and only later, when you look back, do you see them for what they were, the quiet hinges upon which your entire world turned. For me, that moment was the weight of my best friend's head on my shoulder, a simple, profound pressure that recalibrated everything I thought I knew about the architecture of my own heart. It was a silent confession, offered up in the blue light of a television screen, and I was terrified that if I breathed too deeply, if I moved a single inch, the entire fragile structure of our friendship would collapse into dust around us. It began, as so many significant things do, with a text message. A simple, three-word question that lit up my phone screen late on a Wednesday. "You up?" Coming from anyone else, it would have been an innocuous, almost lazy inquiry. But it was from Alex. And Alex never texted first. Not like this. Not after midnight. Our friendship had its own ecosystem, its own established currents and weather patterns, and I was the one who initiated. I was the satellite, orbiting his brighter, more chaotic sun. I would send the meme, suggest the movie, ask about his day. He would respond, always warm, always engaged, but the initial impulse, the first reach across the digital space, was almost invariably mine. This unexpected message was a change in the barometric pressure, a sign that a different kind of weather was rolling in. I spent a full minute just staring at the glowing white letters, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, a strange and unfamiliar anxiety tightening in my chest. This was a deviation from the blueprint of us, and every quiet, hopeful, foolish part of me snapped to attention. Before I could overthink it, before I could build 1,000 different scenarios in my mind, each one more unlikely than the last, I typed back, "Always. What's up?" The reply was almost instantaneous. "Can I come over?" Another jolt. He didn't ask. He usually just appeared, a cheerful whirlwind of takeout bags and bad jokes, using his key to let himself in without ceremony. The politeness, the hesitancy, felt more alarming than a demand. Something was wrong. The carefully constructed walls I kept around my feelings for him, walls I had spent years building, brick by painful brick, suddenly felt paper-thin. My role in our friendship was clear. I was the calm harbor to his restless ocean. I was the steady ground. And the ground does not get to panic when the tide comes in unexpectedly. It just has to be there, solid and waiting. "Doors unlocked," I sent, the words feeling both inadequate and like the only thing I could possibly say. I got up from my desk, the half-edited photograph on my monitor suddenly seeming trivial, and walked into the living room. I turned on a single lamp, casting a soft, golden pool of light on the worn leather of my armchair and the comfortable clutter of my bookshelf. I didn't tidy up. Alex knew the geography of my mess as well as I did. This was my space, yes, but in many ways, it had become our space. His favorite mug was in my cupboard, a well-worn gray hoodie of his was draped over the back of my desk chair, and his ridiculously complicated video game console was a permanent fixture beneath my television. He had colonized my small apartment with the casual, unconscious entitlement of someone who knows, without a single doubt, that they are home. To understand why this small shift in our nightly rhythm felt so seismic, you have to understand the foundation on which we were built. We met in college, a cliché of circumstance. I was the quiet art student, hiding behind a camera lens, cataloging the world from a safe distance. He was the star of the university's soccer team, a supernova of easy confidence and blindingly bright smiles, surrounded by a constellation of friends and admirers. We existed in entirely different orbits, and by all laws of social physics, should never have collided. The collision point was a required literature class, one he was clearly taking to fulfill a credit and one I was taking because I genuinely loved 19th century poetry. He sat next to me on the first day, not out of choice, but because it was the only seat left. He smelled of grass and laundry detergent. He spent the entire lecture doodling intricate, nonsensical patterns in the margins of his notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration. I was, to my own profound annoyance, instantly captivated. It wasn't just his looks, though there was certainly that. It was the way he existed in his own skin, with an unstudied ease that I, in my constant state of self-analysis, could only dream of. He was kinetic energy personified, his leg bouncing under the table, his fingers tapping a rhythm only he could hear. I was still life. I watched people. I framed them in my mind, looked for the light, for the shadows that gave them depth. And in Alex, I saw so much light, it was almost blinding. But I also saw the flicker of something else in the quiet moments, a shadow of exhaustion behind the easy laugh, a pensiveness that didn't quite fit the popular athlete persona. Our friendship didn't ignite, it seeped. It started with him asking to borrow my notes, then asking if I could explain what on earth the professor meant by metaphysical conceits. It evolved into study sessions in the library that were 90% him talking about team politics and 10% me trying to steer him back to John Donne. I learned that the supernova was fueled by a deep-seated need to keep everyone happy, a relentless pressure to perform on and off the field. He was the team captain, the reliable son, the perfect boyfriend to his high school sweetheart, Sarah. He was a collection of roles he played with masterful grace, and I became the one person with whom he didn't have to perform. With me, he could just be Alex. He could complain about the coach, confess his anxieties about post-graduation life, and admit that he sometimes found poetry beautiful, a secret he seemed to guard as if it were a weakness. And me? I fell in love. It wasn't a dramatic, cinematic fall. It was a slow, quiet sinking. It was the warmth that spread through my chest when he'd greet me with a loud, ridiculous nickname across the campus quad. It was the unconscious way he'd lean into my space when we were sitting together, as if drawn by a subtle gravity. It was the way he looked at me when I talked about photography, his usual restless energy stilled, his gaze focused and genuinely curious. I fell in love with the Alex who was hidden from everyone else, the one who was thoughtful and surprisingly vulnerable, the one who remembered a passing comment I made about a rare photography book and then spent weeks tracking it down for my birthday. I packed that love away, stored it in a locked room in the back of my mind, a room I never visited. He was my best friend. He was straight. He had a girlfriend he loved. These were the fundamental, unchangeable laws of our universe. To acknowledge my feelings would be to risk everything, to shatter the one relationship that felt like an anchor in the often turbulent sea of my own introversion. So I became an expert in emotional compartmentalization. I was his friend, his confidant, his quiet harbor. And that, I told myself, would have to be enough. Years passed. We graduated. He got a high-pressure job as a software consultant that sent him flying all over the country. I became a freelance photographer, a life of unpredictable schedules and quiet observation that suited me perfectly. We ended up in the same city, a stroke of luck I never took for granted. Our friendship, untethered from the structure of college, only deepened. My apartment became his home base, the place he'd crash between trips, the place where he could shed the skin of the polished professional and just be. He and Sarah were still together, a long-distance relationship held together by scheduled calls and holiday visits. I listened to him talk about her, about their plans for the future, and I perfected the art of the supportive nod, the encouraging word, all while the locked room in my mind rattled its door. Then came the shift. It started subtly. A text from him at the end of a long day. Just landed. Exhausted. It was a simple status update, but it was information he used to give only to Sarah. I'd find out about his travels after the fact, when he showed up at my door. Then the texts became more frequent. Pictures of sterile hotel rooms with captions like "This is my life now." Questions about my day, not just as a prelude to talking about his, but with genuine follow-up questions. He started checking in. Did you eat? How was that shoot in the rain? Don't stay up all night editing. These were small kindnesses, the kind of gentle nagging that speaks of a deeper, more intimate concern. It was the sort of care I had only ever seen him direct at Sarah. I told myself I was imagining it. I was reading too much into it, projecting my own secret hopes onto the blank screen of our friendship. He was stressed. His job was demanding. His relationship was strained by distance. He was just leaning on his friend. That's what friends do. I repeated this to myself like a mantra, a shield against the dangerous bloom of hope. But it was getting harder to ignore. The balance of our communication had fundamentally altered. He was reaching for me now, consistently and deliberately. And every time my phone buzzed with his name, the locked door in my mind would tremble, and I would have to shove it shut with all my strength. The night he texted to ask if he could come over, the night it all truly began to change, was the night that foundation cracked. He had just gotten back from a 2-week trip to the West Coast. I knew, from a brief, clipped phone call a few days prior, that things with Sarah were not good. He had been vague, deflecting my questions with a hollow-sounding cheerfulness that was more worrying than any confession. When I heard his key in the lock, I braced myself. I didn't know what to expect, but the man who walked through my door was a stranger wearing my best friend's face. He looked hollowed out. His usually bright eyes were dull, shadowed with a weariness that went deeper than jet lag. He dropped his bag by the door with a heavy thud and walked into the living room without a word, his shoulders slumped. He didn't offer a hug or a high five or any of his usual boisterous greetings. He just stood in the middle of my rug, looking lost. "Hey," I said softly, my voice feeling too loud in the sudden, thick silence. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw a flash of such raw, unguarded pain in his eyes that it felt like a physical blow. He swallowed, his throat working. "It's over," he said, and his voice was a wreck. "Sarah and me. It's over," and there it was. The catalyst. The external crisis that would send aftershocks through the careful landscape of our lives. I didn't feel the triumphant glee that some secret, shameful part of me might have expected. I just felt a profound ache for his pain. The locked room in my mind vanished, the door dissolving into nothing, because in that moment, he wasn't the unobtainable object of my affection. He was just Alex. My Alex. And he was hurting. I did the only thing I could. I crossed the space between us and wrapped my arms around him. He was rigid at first, a statue of misery, and then, with a shuddering breath, he collapsed against me. He buried his face in my shoulder, and I felt the dampness of his tears soaking through my t-shirt. He didn't make a sound, but his whole body shook with silent, repressed sobs. I just held him, my hand rubbing circles on his back, my own heart a painful, frantic drum against my ribs. I held him until the shaking subsided, until his breathing evened out into ragged, exhausted sighs. We stood like that for a long time, in the quiet lamplight of my living room, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the ground beneath our feet had irrevocably shifted. The old rules no longer applied. A new map would have to be drawn, and we were standing in uncharted territory. That night marked the beginning of the ritual. After he finally pulled away, his face blotchy and his eyes raw, he didn't want to talk about it. He just sank onto my couch, picked up the remote, and turned on the television, keeping the volume low. He stared blankly at the screen, and I sat in the armchair across from him, a silent sentinel. The space between us felt charged, filled with all the things he wasn't saying. Around 2 in the morning, his eyes started to droop. "You can take the bed," I said, my voice gentle. "I'll crash out here." He shook his head, a slow, tired motion. "No, man. It's your place. I'll take the couch." This was our usual, polite negotiation. But tonight, it felt different. He looked so fragile, so adrift. The thought of him sleeping alone, even in the next room, felt wrong. "Don't be an idiot," I said, trying for a note of our old, easy banter. "My bed's bigger. We can both fit. It's fine." I expected him to protest, to make a joke about it. He didn't. He just looked at me with those exhausted eyes and gave a small, defeated nod. And so, we went to my room. I gave him a clean t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants, and we got into my bed, the mattress dipping under our combined weight. We lay on our backs, a careful foot of space between us, staring up at the ceiling. The silence was immense. It was a silence I was desperate to fill and terrified to break. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could hear the soft catch in his breathing. My entire being was a live wire, acutely aware of his proximity. This was a line we had never crossed. In all our years of friendship, all the late nights and shared spaces, we had never shared a bed. It was an unspoken boundary, a final frontier of platonic friendship that we had, up until now, respected without question. I lay there for what felt like hours, my muscles rigid, my mind racing. I was cataloging every sensation, the scent of his soap, the whisper of the sheets as he shifted his weight, the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest in my peripheral vision. I was so focused on not moving, on not making him uncomfortable, that I barely breathed. And then, he rolled over, his back to me. I thought he was finally going to sleep. But a few moments later, he rolled back, facing me this time. The space between us had shrunk. I could see the faint outline of his features in the dim light filtering in from the street lamp outside my window. He was quiet for so long I thought he had drifted off, but then he spoke, his voice a low murmur in the dark. Jules. Yeah. My own voice was tight, strained. Thanks, he whispered. For this. For being here, always, I whispered back. The word felt enormous, weighted with all the years of unspoken feeling I had packed into it. He shifted again, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was enough to close the remaining distance between us. His knee brushed against mine. The contact was electric, a jolt that shot straight through me. I held my breath, waiting for him to pull back, to apologize for the accidental touch. He didn't. The contact remained, a small, warm point of pressure in the vast, silent darkness. And then, slowly, tentatively, he reached out and his hand found mine under the covers. He didn't interlace his fingers with mine. He just laid his hand over top of my own, his palm covering my knuckles, a gesture of such profound, simple comfort that it broke something open inside me. I felt a hot sting behind my eyes. This was not the touch of a lover. It was the touch of someone seeking an anchor in a storm. And yet, for me, it was everything. It was a universe of meaning in a single, simple gesture. I lay there, perfectly still, his hand covering mine, his leg a warm line against my own, and listened to his breathing finally deepen into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. I did not sleep at all. I stayed awake until the sun began to cast a gray light into the room, terrified that if I moved, if I fell asleep, I would wake up to find it was all a dream. This became our new normal. The ritual. Alex didn't go back to his own apartment, a sterile, empty box that he and Sarah had picked out together. He stayed with me. During the day, he was a ghost, moving through the rooms with a listless energy, making half-hearted attempts to work from his laptop at my kitchen table, taking long, aimless walks. He barely ate. He spoke in monosyllables. I gave him space, orbiting him carefully, offering food he wouldn't eat and conversation he wouldn't engage in. I watched him diminish, the bright light of him dimming day by day, and it was agonizing. But at night, everything changed. The unspoken agreement of that first night solidified into a routine. We would end up on the couch, the television a flickering, silent companion. I would watch as the tension in his shoulders would slowly, almost imperceptibly, begin to release. He would lean his head back, his eyes closed. And then, at some point, he would shift. He would turn toward me, curl his long legs up onto the cushions, and rest his head on my lap. The first time he did it, I froze, my entire body going rigid with shock. He didn't seem to notice. He just let out a long, shuddering sigh, as if he had been holding his breath for days, and closed his eyes. I sat there, a statue with a human head in its lap, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could feel the silkiness of his hair against the rough denim of my jeans. I could smell the faint scent of my own shampoo on him. After a long, agonizing moment, I slowly, cautiously, lifted my hand and rested it on his shoulder. He didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed to relax further into the touch. So this was the ritual. Couch, television, silence. And then, the slow, inevitable drift into physical contact. Sometimes he would rest his head on my lap. Other nights, he would stretch out and lay his head on my shoulder, his arm draped loosely around my waist. He never asked. He never acknowledged it the next day. It was a transaction that took place in the liminal space between waking and sleeping, a space where the rules of the waking world were suspended. It was a purely physical expression of a need so deep he couldn't put it into words. He needed to be held. He needed to be anchored. And I, the quiet observer, the eternal harbor, was the only one he would allow to do it. I lived for those nights, and I dreaded them. They were a source of exquisite torture. Every evening, I would feel the hum of anticipation begin in my veins. Would he do it again tonight? Would he lean into me? Would he reach for me? The anxiety was a physical thing, a knot in my stomach. And when he did, when his weight finally settled against me, it was a relief so profound it was almost painful. For those few hours, I could pretend. I could allow myself to believe that this wasn't just about his grief. I could interpret the unconscious intimacy as something more. I could feel the warmth of his body, the rhythm of his breathing, and I could imagine a world where this was not a temporary comfort, but a permanent state of being. I was a cartographer of his smallest movements, mapping the terrain of his grief through the language of touch. The way his fingers would sometimes twitch and curl into the fabric of my shirt. The soft, unguarded sound he would make in his sleep. The way, just before drifting off, he would sometimes sigh my name, a barely audible whisper. Each touch was a clue. Each gesture was a piece of a puzzle I was desperately trying to solve. Was this just what friends did? Was he so shattered that all his boundaries had dissolved? Or was there something else stirring in the deep? Something he himself didn't understand yet? I would analyze every moment, replaying it in my mind until it was worn smooth. He was using me. The thought was a cold, sharp thing. He was using me for comfort, for a warm body in the dark, and he was either oblivious to what it was doing to me, or he simply didn't care. But then I would look at him, at the genuine, unfeigned vulnerability in his face as he slept, and I couldn't bring myself to believe it. This wasn't a calculated act. This was pure, unadulterated need. Alex, who had always been the strong one, the one who took care of everyone else, had finally allowed himself to be taken care of. And he had chosen me. This went on for weeks. The ghost of him during the day, the seeking, silent man at night. He started talking more, in small bursts. He would tell me a story about Sarah, a memory that had surfaced, and his voice would be flat, detached, as if he were talking about people in a movie. He never cried again after that first night. He seemed to have locked his grief away in a place I couldn't reach. The only access I had to his pain was through the nightly ritual, through the silent language of his body seeking comfort from mine. One night, the ritual changed. We were on the couch, in our usual positions, him stretched out with his head in my lap. I had my laptop balanced on my knees, trying to do some editing, my fingers moving slowly over the trackpad. A movie we had both seen a dozen times was playing on the screen. He had been quiet for a long time, and I assumed he was asleep. My hand was resting on his back, a familiar, comfortable weight. Without opening his eyes, he reached up and took my other hand, the one that had been on the laptop. He pulled it down and held it against his chest, lacing his fingers through mine. My breath caught in my throat. This was different. This was not the passive acceptance of comfort. This was an active reach. His grip was firm, conscious. His thumb began to stroke the back of my hand, a slow, deliberate, rhythmic motion. I stopped breathing entirely. I stared down at our joined hands, at the way his larger, calloused fingers were woven through my own. It was the most intimate gesture we had ever shared. It was a gesture that belonged to lovers, to couples. It did not belong to us. And yet, here it was. Undeniable. My mind went into overdrive. What did this mean? Was he awake? Did he know what he was doing? Was this a subconscious slip, or a deliberate signal? I was terrified to move, to speak, to do anything that might break the spell. So I just sat there, my body rigid, my heart a frantic bird beating against my ribs, and I let him hold my hand. The movie ended. The credits rolled. The screen went black, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the city outside my window. And still, he held my hand, his thumb never ceasing its slow, hypnotic stroking. "Alex," I finally whispered, my voice hoarse. He didn't answer for a long time. I was sure he had fallen asleep, that the whole thing had been a dream. But then he squeezed my hand. "Don't go," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, the words a solemn vow. He sighed, a sound of deep contentment, and his grip on my hand loosened as he finally drifted into a deeper sleep. I gently extricated my fingers from his and closed the laptop. I didn't have the heart to move him. I just sat there in the dark, watching him sleep, our hands now resting side by side on his chest. The lines were blurring. The carefully drawn map of our friendship was becoming a smudge of indecipherable ink. He was grieving. He was lost. And I was falling deeper and deeper into a hope so dangerous it felt like a sickness. I was building a home for myself in his gestures, furnishing rooms with his sighs and his sleepy murmurs. I was constructing an entire future on a foundation that might be nothing more than sand, ready to be washed away by the morning tide. But in the quiet darkness of my living room, with his hand next to mine and his breathing a steady rhythm in the silence, it felt like the most solid ground I had ever known. The crossing of the Rubicon, when it came, was not a dramatic, charging battle. It was as quiet and tentative as everything else that had led us to that point. It happened on a Sunday, a gray, drizzly afternoon that matched the mood that had settled in my apartment for the past month. Alex had shown the first flicker of his old self that morning. He had woken up before me, and when I stumbled into the kitchen, I found him making coffee, the real kind, not the instant sludge he usually resorted to. He even made a joke, a weak, watery version of his old humor, but it was there, a small green shoot pushing its way through cracked concrete. We spent the day in a state of peaceful, almost domestic quiet. We didn't talk much, but the silence was different. It wasn't the heavy, grief-laden silence of the previous weeks. It was comfortable, companionable. We read on the couch, our legs tangled together under a shared blanket. For the first time, the physical contact felt normal, unburdened by the weight of analysis. It was just us. It felt, for a few precious hours, like this was simply what we did. This was who we were. That evening, we decided to watch a new movie, something neither of us had seen. We were back on the couch, in what had become our default position, me propped up against the armrest, him lying with his head on my chest, the blanket pulled up to our chins. The movie was a tense thriller, and during a particularly startling scene, he flinched, his hand instinctively grabbing my t-shirt. I rested my hand on his head, my fingers tangling in his soft hair, a gesture meant to be soothing. But this time, something was different. He didn't relax under my touch. Instead, he lifted his head, turning to look up at me. The movie forgotten, the sound of it faded into a distant hum. The only thing that existed was the space between our faces, shortened to a matter of inches. The blue light from the television cast strange shadows across his features, making his eyes seem darker, deeper. He was looking at me in a way he had never looked at me before. The friendly affection, the needy grief, it was all gone. In its place was an expression I couldn't decipher. It was a question. It was a confession. It was a plea. My heart stopped. Or maybe it started beating so fast it felt like it had stopped. My hand was still in his hair, and my thumb, of its own accord, began to gently stroke his temple. His eyes fluttered shut for a moment, and he leaned into my touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken words, with years of repressed feelings. The locked room in my mind was gone forever, its contents spilled out into this small, charged space between us. He opened his eyes again, and his gaze dropped to my lips. It was the briefest of glances, a flicker, but I saw it, and it sent a shockwave through my entire system. This was it. This was the moment where the world would either crack open or slam shut. The choice, I realized with a terrifying clarity, was mine. I could pull back. I could make a joke, break the tension, and pretend this moment never happened. I could retreat to the safety of our old friendship, to the quiet harbor where the boats were never rocked. Or I could stay. I could hold his gaze. I could let this happen. I chose to stay. I held my breath, and I watched as he slowly, hesitantly, began to close the final distance between us. He was watching my eyes, searching for a sign, for a warning, for a stoplight. I gave him none. I just watched him come closer, my entire world narrowing to the soft parting of his lips, to the scent of him, to the warmth of his breath against my skin. He paused, a millimeter from my mouth, his eyes asking the final, silent question. And in that last, infinite moment of stillness, all the fear, all the anxiety, all the years of hopeless yearning simply dissolved. All that was left was a profound sense of rightness, of inevitability. This was where we had been heading all along, through all the late-night talks, the shared laughter, the silent comfort. This was the destination that had been waiting for us at the end of the long, winding road of our friendship. And then he kissed me. It was not a kiss of passion or of desperate hunger. It was the softest, most tentative kiss I had ever known. It was a question, a whisper of lips against mine. It was gentle and searching and unbelievably sweet. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and uncertainty and a deep, bone-weary sadness. But underneath it all, there was something else. A flicker of hope, a spark of discovery. I responded with equal gentleness, meeting his tentative pressure with a quiet affirmation of my own. My hand slid from his hair to cup the back of his neck, my fingers warm against his skin. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was a lifetime. It was the rewriting of every rule, the redrawing of every map. He pulled back slowly, his eyes still closed, his forehead resting against mine. We stayed like that, breathing the same air, the sound of the forgotten movie a distant, meaningless noise. "Jules," he breathed. and my name was a fragile, broken thing on his lips. I couldn't speak. I just tightened my grip on his neck, a silent message that I was here, that I wasn't going anywhere. He opened his eyes, and the confusion and fear I saw there was so profound it made my own heart ache. He looked like a man who had just woken up in a foreign country, with no idea how he had gotten there. He scrambled off me, moving to the far end of the couch, putting a sudden, shocking chasm of space between us. He ran a hand through his hair, his movements jerky and panicked. He started, his voice rough. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I don't know why I did that. I'm so sorry. Each word was a stone, building a new wall between us. The beautiful, fragile connection of a moment ago shattered into a million pieces. The fear I had held at bay for so long came rushing back, a cold, sickening tide. I had misread everything. I had taken his grief and his need, and I had twisted it into something it wasn't. He wasn't discovering a new feeling. He was just lost, and he had made a mistake. A terrible, friendship-ending mistake. Alex, I said, my own voice sounding hollow and distant to my ears. No, just forget it. Please, he said, not looking at me. He stood up, pacing the small space of my living room like a caged animal. I'm messed up. My head's not right. It was a mistake, a mistake. The word echoed in the silent room. He had taken the most significant moment of my life and dismissed it as an error, a glitch in his grief-addled programming. The pain was sharp and sudden, a physical blow that left me breathless. I felt like a fool, a hopeful, pathetic fool. Without another word, he walked out of the living room, not to my bedroom, but to the front door. He grabbed his keys from the bowl on the table. Where are you going? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I should go, he said, his back still to me. I need some air. I need to clear my head. And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, a sound of shocking finality. I was left alone on the couch, in the flickering blue light of a movie I would never finish, the ghost of his kiss still on my lips. The silence he left behind was heavier, more profound, than any silence we had ever shared. It was the silence of a ruin, the silence of an ending. The aftermath was a brutal, quiet hell. Alex didn't come back that night. He didn't answer my texts. He didn't pick up my calls. For 3 days, there was nothing. The silence from his end was absolute, a digital void that was more punishing than any angry words could have been. I moved through my apartment like a ghost, haunted by the memory of him in every room. His mug was still by the sink. His hoodie was still on my chair. His presence lingered, a constant, painful reminder of what I had so briefly held and so catastrophically lost. My mind became a torture chamber of self-recrimination. I replayed the kiss, the moments leading up to it, over and over again, searching for the point where I went wrong. Had I imagined the look in his eyes? Had I leaned in? Had my own desperate longing somehow willed the moment into existence, forcing him into something he never wanted? I had violated the most sacred rule of our friendship. I had made him feel unsafe. The harbor had become a storm. I had taken his vulnerability and I had used it, whether consciously or not, to fulfill my own selfish desires. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I convinced myself that it was over. I had not only lost the fantasy of a future with him, but I had lost the reality of the present. I had lost my best friend. The pain of it was a dull, constant ache, a chronic illness for which there was no cure. I tried to work, to lose myself in the familiar comfort of my camera and my editing software, but the images on the screen were just meaningless pixels. The world outside my window seemed muted, the colors leached out. On the 4th day, he finally texted, "Can we talk?" Just 3 words. The same number of words that had started this whole mess. My heart leaped into my throat, a frantic, hopeful thing. But I crushed it down. This wouldn't be a reconciliation. This would be the formal, final severing. The conversation where he would apologize again, tell me he valued our friendship too much to have made things so weird, and then we would both pretend the last month had never happened, retreating to our safe, platonic corners, a new, uncrossable distance between us. The thought was unbearable, but it was better than this agonizing silence. I told him to come over. I needed this to happen in our space, in the place where everything had changed. I needed to face the ghost. I spent the next hour pacing, rehearsing speeches in my head. I would be calm. I would be understanding. I would take all the blame. I would make it easy for him. I would sacrifice my own heart on the altar of our friendship if it meant I could somehow keep him in my life, even in a diminished capacity. When he arrived, he looked worse than he had the night of the breakup. He was pale, his eyes were red-rimmed, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He walked in and stood awkwardly in the entryway, refusing to come any further, as if he no longer had the right to occupy this space. "Hey," he said, his voice raw. "Hey," I replied. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do the calm, understanding friend routine. The hurt was too raw. I had to know. "Was it a mistake, Alex?" I asked, and the words came out colder, sharper than I intended. "The kiss. Was it just a mistake?" He flinched, as if I had struck him. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were swimming with a miserable confusion. "I don't know," he whispered, and the honesty of it was more painful than a lie. "Jules, I don't know what's wrong with me. My whole life. It's been a straight line. School, soccer, Sarah, the job. I knew what I was supposed to do, who I was supposed to be. And now, that line is gone. Everything is broken." He was not talking about Sarah anymore. I knew it. He was talking about us. He was talking about the kiss. And me? I pushed, my voice trembling. What am I in all of this? Am I just a temporary stopgap? A warm body to get you through a bad time? Because if that's what this is, you need to tell me. Because what you called a mistake. That wasn't a mistake for me, Alex. That was everything. The confession hung in the air between us, terrifying and liberating. I had finally said it. The secret I had carried for a decade was out. The door to that locked room was not just open. It had been ripped from its hinges. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. He looked utterly poleaxed. He sank down onto the edge of the armchair, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said, his voice muffled by his hands. "You're the only person, the only thing that's felt real in months. Being here, with you. It's the only time I haven't felt like I was drowning. And I got scared. I felt something, in that moment. Something I wasn't supposed to feel. And I panicked. I ran. Because it's easier to call it a mistake than to face what it might actually mean." He looked up at me, and his face was a mask of torment. "What does it mean, Jules? What if I'm not who I thought I was? What if I've been lying to everyone, to Sarah, to myself, my entire life?" The confrontation I had dreaded had turned into something else entirely. This wasn't about him rejecting me. This was about him rejecting himself. The withdrawal, the panic. It hadn't been about me at all. It was the terror of a man whose entire identity had been called into question by a single, gentle kiss. He was staring into a chasm that had opened up at his feet, and he was terrified of falling in. My own hurt and anger evaporated, replaced by a wave of overwhelming empathy. I crossed the room and knelt in front of him, so we were at eye level. "Hey," I said softly. "Look at me." He met my gaze, his own eyes filled with a desperate plea. "We don't have to have the answers right now," I said, my voice steady. "We don't have to label anything. All that matters is what's real. And what happened between us. That was real. What you felt, whatever it was real. You don't have to be scared of it. Not with me." A single tear traced a path through the stubble on his cheek. He reached out, his hand shaking, and cupped my face. His thumb stroked my cheekbone, a mirror of the gesture he had made on the couch so many nights before. "I'm so tired of being scared," he whispered. "Then don't be," I whispered back. "Just be here. With me." He leaned forward, and this time, there was no hesitation. He kissed me again, and this kiss was different. It was not a question. It was an answer. It was raw and desperate, and full of all the fear and confusion and pain of the last few days, of the last few weeks, of his entire life. But underneath it, there was a current of profound relief. The relief of a man who has finally stopped running. It was the kiss of a man coming home. Our resolution was not a grand, declarative statement. It was a quiet, gradual process of healing, of learning a new language together. The days that followed were marked by a new kind of intimacy, one built on a foundation of terrifying honesty. There were no more rituals performed under the cover of darkness and plausible deniability. Everything was out in the open now, exposed to the light. We talked. We truly talked, for hours, for days. He talked about the suffocating weight of expectations, the feeling of playing a part his whole life. He talked about Sarah, not with the pain of a lost love, but with the sad guilt of someone who realizes they were never able to give their partner the one thing they truly deserved, an honest version of themselves. And I talked. I told him about the years of quiet longing, about the locked room in my mind. I told him about the exquisite torture of the nightly rituals, about the hope and the fear. I laid myself bare, and instead of running, he listened. He absorbed my words, his expression a mixture of awe and regret. He would reach for my hand, his grip firm and reassuring, as if to say, "I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." The physical affection changed, too. It was no longer a desperate, unconscious seeking of comfort. It was deliberate, intentional. It was him, in the middle of the day, wrapping his arms around me from behind while I was making coffee, resting his chin on my shoulder, and just holding me. It was me, reaching out to trace the line of his jaw while we were watching a movie, a simple touch that was now free of fear and analysis. We still slept in the same bed, but now we fell asleep facing each other, his arm draped over my waist, my head tucked under his chin. The space between us was gone, filled with a sense of peace so profound it felt like a miracle. One evening, about a week after our confrontation, I found him standing by the front door, holding the spare key I had given him years ago. He was just looking at it, turning it over and over in his palm. "What are you thinking?" I asked softly. He looked up at me, a small, sad smile on his face. "I was just thinking about how I used to use this key," he said. "I'd just walk in, make noise, throw my stuff everywhere. I treated this place like it was an extension of my own. I never stopped to think about what that meant, about how I was taking up your space. It was never just my space," I said. "It was always ours, I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I know it in a different way now. Before, it was a convenience, a crash pad, a safe house. Now it's just home." He stepped forward and handed me the key. I looked at him, confused. "You don't need this anymore," I said. "This is your home, exactly," he said, his eyes shining. "I don't need a key to a place I'm never going to leave," and that was it. That was the promise. Not of forever, not of a perfect, easy future, but of a present, of a commitment to stay, to face the confusion and the fear together, to build something new on the ruins of the lives we thought we were supposed to live. He moved his few remaining things from his old apartment the next weekend. We didn't talk about labels. We didn't define what we were. We just were. We were Julian and Alex. We were two people who had found in each other a place to finally be honest, a place to finally be still. There are moments that change you, not by their volume, but by their weight. They are quiet and profound, and they settle into the very marrow of your being. For me, it was the weight of his head on my shoulder, the weight of his hand in mine, the weight of his heart, finally laid bare for me to see. It was the weight of a spare key, no longer needed. We had navigated the uncharted territory, and we had found our way not to a new land, but back to each other, finally seeing the place we had occupied all along for what it truly was. It was not just a harbor. It was home. And in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, we began to build our lives, not on the blueprints of who we were supposed to be, but on the solid, unshakable ground of who we truly were.